In the deep oppressive heat of Mississippi during the 1830s, the world of slavery was already a nightmare of suffering and fear. But in one small corner of this brutal landscape, two sisters rose above all tales of cruelty, etching their names into history not as victims, but as perpetrators of unimaginable horror. Their story is not just one of violence. It's a dark chapter where power, obsession, and cruelty collided in ways that still shock the mind today. Imagine a place where even the people enslaved trembled not only at the system, but at the hands of these women themselves. This is a story that sits at the crossroads of history and horror, where truth is far stranger and far darker than fiction. The rise of the sisters to power on their plantation was as sudden as it was terrifying, a dark shadow that spread across the fields and cabins with an almost unnatural swiftness. Born into a world where wealth and cruelty were intertwined, the sisters inherited not just land, but a deeply ingrained sense of dominance over those who labored beneath them. From the very beginning, it was clear that they were different, not in appearance, but in temperament. While other plantation owners might have wielded authority through fear tempered with occasional reward, these sisters embraced fear as an art form, studying the weaknesses of those around them and learning to exploit them with surgical precision. They arrived at their estate in Mississippi with the confidence of someone who knew no bounds, their every action calculated to establish an unassailable position at the top of the social hierarchy. The local community, already accustomed to the harshness of slavery, found themselves unsettled by reports of the sisters' unusually cruel disposition, rumors that whispered through the town like a rising wind carrying the stench of decay. From the outset, their methods were subtle but deeply effective. The first to suffer were those who dared to show defiance or even hesitation in their work. The sisters watched the enslaved from the shadows, noting not only disobedience but the smallest flicker of human dignity or resistance. Each infraction, real or imagined, was met with punishment so meticulously applied that it sent a message far beyond the immediate victim. Fear was not incidental to their authority, it was the very foundation of it. The enslaved learned quickly that the smallest slip could result in humiliation, pain, or death, and soon whispers of the sisters' cruelty began to echo among the cabins and fields. They turned everyday tasks into exercises of terror, forcing laborers to work through the sweltering heat until their bodies collapsed, then finding new, inventive ways to prolong their suffering. No one could escape the sisters' gaze. They were always present, whether seen or felt, a lingering shadow of menace that seeped into the very air of the plantation. Their rise was not only a matter of personal cruelty, but also of psychological manipulation. The sisters understood that terror was magnified when the victims felt completely isolated. They cultivated an environment in which trust was impossible, where friendships among the enslaved were met with suspicion and betrayal, where even those assigned to supervise laborers were themselves made to live under constant threat. The sisters would randomly select individuals to punish in public displays, ensuring that the rest watched in silent horror. These punishments were carefully choreographed, designed not merely to discipline, but to break the spirit entirely. The psychological impact of such demonstrations was profound, as it convinced the enslaved that resistance was not only futile but deadly. Each act of cruelty reinforced the sisters' position, turning fear into a tool more powerful than chains or whips alone. In addition to their mastery of fear, the sisters wielded social influence to consolidate their power. They knew the importance of perception, maintaining an outward appearance of refinement and charm when interacting with visitors, neighbors, and local authorities. To the untrained eye, they were genteel and polite, the kind of women who might host a parlor gathering or attend a church service with grace and elegance. But beneath this veneer of civility lay a calculating intelligence that few could detect. They leveraged these appearances to suppress scrutiny, ensuring that even those who suspected their cruelty could not easily act against them. Their manipulation extended to servants, overseers, and even their own family members, as they created a network of fear and compliance that kept the plantation running exactly according to their will. As their influence grew, so did the scope of their cruelty. The sisters seemed almost to revel in the absolute control they held, testing the limits of what people would endure, both physically and mentally. Each day brought a new exercise in domination, a careful orchestration of suffering and obedience that left no room for mercy. Their power was magnified by their unpredictability. No one could anticipate when a punishment might strike or how it would manifest. This unpredictability ensured that the enslaved lived in a constant state of tension, their minds perpetually anticipating the next blow, the next humiliation, the next act of terror. The sisters were not content with mere authority. They demanded absolute submission, a total erasure of resistance or will, and they were willing to escalate their cruelty in pursuit of it. It was through this combination of calculated observation, psychological manipulation, and social strategy that the sisters established themselves as the ultimate figures of power on their plantation. Their reputation extended far beyond their own fields, reaching neighboring estates and towns, whispered about in terrified murmurs by those who had heard or witnessed fragments of their deeds. Yet the sisters themselves seemed almost impervious to rumor or fear, existing in a self-made sphere of dominance where their whims dictated life and death. In every interaction, every command, every glance, they demonstrated a mastery of control that was both mesmerizing and horrifying, an authority that could crush bodies and minds with equal precision. The enslaved learned quickly that survival depended not only on obedience, but on the constant anticipation of cruelty, on the ability to navigate a labyrinth of terror designed by two women whose very presence seemed to darken the world around them. The cruelty of the sisters was not merely physical, but calculated with a cold, deliberate precision that transformed everyday life into a relentless nightmare for those enslaved on their plantation. Every tool, every object, every circumstance could be turned into an instrument of torment, and the sisters discovered methods that were both inventive and horrifying in their efficiency. They treated the bodies and minds of their victims as if they were experiments, testing limits, measuring reactions, and refining their techniques in ways that suggested a deep, almost unnatural understanding of fear itself. No one was spared from their attention. Infants, the elderly and the infirm were subjected to punishments as arbitrary as they were brutal. The sisters seemed to take particular satisfaction in finding new ways to extend suffering, to ensure that terror lingered long after the initial act had concluded. It was not enough for someone to feel pain. They had to be broken entirely, their spirit diminished to the faintest flicker of what had once been human resilience. Whipping was common, of course, but the sisters elevated it to an art form, alternating the severity, timing, and method to prevent the enslaved from ever becoming desensitized. They would leave patterns of bruises, deliberately alternating between harsh lashes and lighter strikes to prolong the agony, and sometimes they used implements that were twisted, rough, or jagged, ensuring that each blow tore more than skin, it shredded flesh, leaving the victims weakened and terrified. They took joy in watching the subtle changes in posture, the fear in eyes, the trembling of muscles, as if the suffering itself were a language through which they communicated dominance. But physical punishment was only one part of their repertoire. They understood the potency of humiliation, often forcing victims into degrading positions, making them perform tasks under ridicule, and ensuring that every interaction reinforced a sense of inferiority and despair. Hunger and deprivation were equally central to their cruelty. Meals were given sparingly, sometimes withheld entirely, and when they were distributed, the sisters would often ensure that the portions were insufficient, cold, or contaminated. Starvation was not random. It was a carefully calculated measure to weaken both body and spirit, to make the enslaved more pliable, more dependent, more fearful. They would watch as individuals consumed their meager rations, taking pleasure in the way desperation twisted human behavior, observing fights, jealousy, and despair erupt among those forced to compete for scraps. Even sleep offered no refuge, as the sisters frequently disrupted rest, waking the enslaved in the dead of night to carry out sudden labor or punishments, instilling a sense of perpetual vigilance, of never-ending anxiety. The sisters were also experts at psychological torment, understanding that fear could be as debilitating as physical pain. They employed threats of death or severe injury, sometimes carrying out minor acts of violence to demonstrate capability, while leaving the larger, more horrific punishments implied but unfulfilled. This technique, the constant threat of unknown consequences, created a climate of mental exhaustion. Individuals began to anticipate pain at every turn, imagining punishments where none had yet occurred, internalizing fear until it became a constant companion. Even those who survived the harshest measures were never free from the mental imprint of the sisters' cruelty. The terror lingered in dreams, in glances at the sisters' presence, in the oppressive silence that pervaded the plantation. They manipulated the social dynamics of the enslaved as a further form of control, pitting individuals against one another through forced confessions, selective punishments, and rewards that were always cruelly conditional. Trust and loyalty became liabilities, as the sisters ensured that every relationship was fraught with tension and suspicion. Bonds formed in secrecy were discovered and punished, creating an environment where human connection itself became dangerous. They often singled out individuals for special torment, forcing others to witness the suffering, ensuring that the psychological impact extended beyond the immediate victim. Public executions, prolonged beatings, and forced labor in extreme conditions became lessons for the entire community, reinforcing the sisters' dominance and spreading terror like a contagion. Even medical care or attention was twisted into a tool of cruelty. When injuries were inflicted, the sisters sometimes denied treatment, allowed infections to fester, or applied remedies that caused additional pain. They understood anatomy well enough to exploit vulnerabilities, and the enslaved became hyper-aware of how fragile their own bodies were under such relentless surveillance. Illness or weakness was punished as if it were willful disobedience, and the sisters would often use sickness as an excuse to further humiliate or terrorize, turning even natural vulnerability into a source of fear. The sheer ingenuity of their methods ensured that every aspect of daily life, work, food, rest, relationships, and even health, was manipulated to maximize suffering. The numbers of those who perished under their hands or as a direct consequence of their cruelty, 42 in a single year, were almost inconceivable, yet they were the result of consistent, calculated measures rather than chaotic brutality. Death was not random. It was the ultimate reinforcement of power, a final demonstration of what happened to those who resisted or even failed to meet expectations. Each life lost was a grim reminder to the survivors, a chilling testament to the sisters' mastery of terror, and an indelible mark on the history of the plantation. It was through this intricate web of physical punishment, psychological manipulation, social control, and strategic deprivation that the sisters created a regime of horror that few could withstand. Their cruelty was totalizing, extending into every corner of life on the plantation, leaving no refuge, no relief, and no hope. The enslaved existed in a world where terror was omnipresent, their every action monitored, judged, and punished, and the sisters stood at the center of it all, orchestrating suffering with a terrifying precision, a constant oppressive force whose power seemed limitless. The terror inflicted by the sisters extended far beyond the lash or the deprivation of food. It penetrated the mind and soul, transforming every thought and every instinct into a battleground for survival. They understood that fear could be wielded as deftly as any whip, that the uncertainty of what might happen next could create a far more profound obedience than any act of punishment alone. Every glance, every gesture, every word from the sisters was imbued with the capacity to manipulate, to unsettle, to dominate. The enslaved quickly learned that even the smallest misstep could invite repercussions, not just for themselves, but for those around them, and that awareness alone was enough to keep them in a state of near-constant dread. The sisters cultivated an environment in which the mind became a weapon of control, where every heartbeat, every thought, every fleeting impulse was monitored and judged, and the consequences of failure were often fatal or unimaginably cruel. One of their most insidious tactics was unpredictability. No one could anticipate when a punishment might strike, when a harsh word would cut or a command would escalate into physical violence. This uncertainty infected daily life with anxiety so pervasive that it became almost a physical presence, a weight pressing upon the chest of every enslaved individual. The sisters would move silently through the plantation, appearing without warning to witness labor, to inspect living quarters, to interrogate or humiliate, leaving the enslaved constantly alert, constantly guessing, constantly afraid. The unpredictability was not merely for spectacle, it was a strategic assault on the human psyche, breaking the will to resist even in the briefest moments of courage. The enslaved came to understand that survival required not only obedience, but an almost preternatural vigilance, an ability to anticipate cruelty before it was inflicted, to navigate a landscape in which every detail could be weaponized. They were masters of manipulation through social isolation. By turning the enslaved against one another, they destroyed trust, friendships, and bonds that might have provided comfort or solidarity. Informants were rewarded, confessions coerced, and punishments inflicted selectively to sow discord. Each act of betrayal was amplified, witnessed by others to ensure that fear spread like a contagion. The enslaved learned that loyalty could be punished as easily as disobedience, and that even a kind word, a helping hand, or a whispered conversation could result in severe consequences. The sisters understood that when people could not rely on each other for protection or support, the power dynamic shifted entirely, leaving them completely dependent on the whims of their oppressors. This psychological isolation intensified the impact of other forms of cruelty, ensuring that fear penetrated every corner of the mind. The sisters also exploited superstition and rumor to heighten terror. In a world where the enslaved often carried beliefs rooted in spiritual and cultural traditions, the sisters inserted themselves into these systems of thought, presenting themselves as omnipresent, almost supernatural forces of punishment, whispers of curses, of eyes that never missed a misdeed, of punishments that struck even those who thought themselves unseen, circulated freely, creating a pervasive sense of doom. They understood the power of suggestion and rumor, cultivating stories that magnified their own reputation while making the enslaved hyper-aware of every action, every mistake, and every imagined slight. Even those who had not directly witnessed an act of cruelty carried the psychological weight of it, internalizing fear as a constant companion. The sisters' interrogation tactics were another pillar of their psychological manipulation. They demanded confessions for real or imagined transgressions, often using prolonged questioning that exhausted both body and mind. They would alternate between seemingly gentle questioning and sudden, violent outbursts, keeping the victims in a state of terror that eroded rational thought. The goal was not simply to extract information, but to create a condition in which the enslaved became entirely malleable, their sense of self diminished, their perception of reality shaped by the terror imposed upon them. Even those who attempted to maintain composure found themselves unraveling, their thoughts dominated by fear, their judgment clouded, their every choice calculated not by desire, but by the instinct to avoid punishment. Sleep became another instrument of domination. The sisters would awaken the enslaved in the dead of night to enforce tasks, deliver punishments, or conduct inspections, ensuring that exhaustion compounded the terror of the day. Dreams themselves became a source of anxiety as the mind could not find refuge from the constant threat, and waking moments offered no relief, only the continuation of surveillance and control. The enslaved lived in a perpetual state of hypervigilance, their bodies and minds responding automatically to cues of danger, their identities reshaped around the need to survive the sisters' cruelty. Even subtle gestures, the tilt of a head, a sharp glance, a casual command, could be used as reminders of omnipresent authority. The sisters' mastery of this psychological warfare ensured that their power was total and pervasive. Fear was no longer a reaction to a single act of cruelty. It became an internalized condition, a constant companion that dictated thought, movement, and speech. Resistance became almost impossible because the mind itself had been trained to anticipate punishment, to calculate risk, and to prioritize survival above all else. This combination of unpredictability, social isolation, exploitation of superstition, and constant surveillance created a system in which terror became a living, breathing force, one that sustained the sisters' absolute control over every aspect of the plantation and left the enslaved trapped in a state of unending psychological torment. Mississippi in 1836 was a place where the law and social customs were constructed to favor power and property over justice and humanity, and within this framework, the sisters' reign of terror found fertile ground to grow unchecked. The institution of slavery was deeply entrenched, supported not only by the economy, but by the culture itself, which normalized cruelty as a necessary instrument to maintain order and productivity. Enslaved people were legally regarded as property, their lives subject to the absolute control of their owners, and any act of resistance or defiance was punishable by severe, often lethal, means. Within this structure, brutality was codified and sanctioned, allowing the sisters to manipulate the law to their advantage, committing acts that might be considered monstrous in any other context, but were overlooked or dismissed because of the pervasive social acceptance of violence against those enslaved. Even neighboring landowners and local officials, while perhaps uneasy with the sisters' extremities, were bound by the same social and legal expectations, rendering intervention unlikely. The system itself provided both cover and implicit approval, creating a climate in which fear could flourish unchecked. Beyond the formal law, social norms in Mississippi reinforced hierarchies of power in ways that made resistance almost inconceivable. The planter elite, of which the sisters were a part, were expected to assert control with an iron hand, and cruelty was often seen as a sign of competence and authority rather than moral failing. Reports of punishment, intimidation, or even death were filtered through lenses that prioritized economic stability and social order over human suffering. The local courts, when they did consider allegations of excessive abuse, rarely acted, and when they did, the punishments for white perpetrators were minimal, serving as little more than a symbolic acknowledgement that law existed. Within this context, the sisters could escalate their cruelty with little fear of real consequence, knowing that the combination of legal immunity and social expectation effectively insulated them from accountability. Rumors of their brutality might reach the ears of magistrates or neighbors, but the weight of property rights and the economic imperatives of slavery meant that the sisters' actions were largely tolerated, their cruelty seen as an extension of the control necessary to maintain the plantation's operation. The local economy further reinforced the sisters' power. Mississippi in 1836 was heavily dependent on agriculture, particularly cotton, which demanded a labor force that could be controlled with precision. Enslaved people were viewed not as human beings but as tools of production, and any act that increased their obedience or efficiency, including terror and extreme punishment, was tacitly encouraged. In this environment, cruelty was not merely tolerated, it was often praised as effective management. The sisters, astute observers of human behavior, understood the interplay between economic necessity and social expectation, and they leveraged it to enhance their authority. The fear they instilled was framed not as sadism, but as discipline, a method of maintaining order in a system designed to strip people of autonomy and humanity. Religion and moral justification also played a role in sustaining their power. Many in the white community used selective interpretations of scripture to defend slavery, to frame dominance and punishment as divinely sanctioned, and to normalize cruelty as a necessary instrument of moral and social order. The sisters, whether devout or opportunistic in their use of religious rhetoric, operated within this context, using prevailing moral arguments to legitimize their actions and deflect scrutiny. Neighbors who might otherwise question the extremity of their methods often accepted them as part of a moral hierarchy in which the enslaved were inherently subordinate and therefore subject to correction and control. The sisters' cruelty in this environment was not an anomaly, but an amplification of accepted norms, pushed to its darkest extremes. Communication and isolation further cemented their impunity. Plantations were often isolated, separated by miles of forest, river, or farmland, making it difficult for outsiders to witness firsthand the extent of abuse. Reports could be dismissed as exaggeration, and those who attempted to intervene faced logistical challenges as well as social pressure to remain silent. The sisters capitalized on this isolation, cultivating an outward appearance of genteel propriety when outsiders did come near, while the reality of terror unfolded behind closed doors. This duality reinforced the power dynamic, ensuring that even those inclined to question their actions had insufficient evidence or opportunity to act. Within the plantation, the lack of external oversight allowed the sisters to refine their methods of cruelty, experimenting with new punishments and control strategies in ways that might have drawn censure elsewhere, but were effectively invisible in their remote environment. The convergence of law, social norms, economic incentive, religious justification, and geographic isolation created an ecosystem in which the sisters could operate with near total impunity. Their cruelty, while extraordinary in its intensity and scope, was enabled by a society structured to prioritize property and hierarchy over human life, to value obedience over morality, and to tolerate horrors that would be unconscionable in any system designed to protect the vulnerable. Within this landscape, terror became not only a tool, but a necessity for survival, a currency in which the sisters amassed absolute authority, and the enslaved found themselves trapped in a world where the law, the neighbors, and even morality itself offered no protection against the relentless domination of two women who had mastered cruelty in every conceivable form. The legacy of the sisters extended far beyond the immediate horrors of their plantation, seeping into the collective memory of the region and casting a long, dark shadow over generations that followed. Even after the years of their reign of terror had passed, stories of their cruelty persisted, whispered among descendants of the enslaved and murmured by neighboring families who had witnessed fragments of their acts. Their names became synonymous with fear, an enduring symbol of the extremes of human cruelty, and the legends that grew around them often blurred the line between history and folklore. Tales spoke not only of the punishments and deaths they inflicted, but of an almost supernatural presence, a pervasive sense of menace that seemed to linger in the very air long after they were gone. Travelers passing through the region would occasionally mention the old plantation, now abandoned or repurposed, noting a strange heaviness, a lingering chill, as if the violence committed there had left an imprint on the land itself. The surviving enslaved carried these memories like scars, their recollections forming the backbone of oral history that preserved the sisters' reputation long after official records had faded or ignored the extent of their crimes. They spoke of the meticulousness with which punishments were delivered, the unpredictability that left entire groups in states of perpetual terror, and the psychological games that had transformed them into shadows of themselves. Even those who were too young to remember specific incidents internalized the atmosphere of fear that had been instilled, and as they recounted their experiences to children and grandchildren, the stories became moral warnings, cautionary tales about the capacity for cruelty when power is unchecked. The impact on families extended for decades as trauma passed from one generation to the next, leaving a lasting imprint on communities that had been touched, however indirectly, by the sisters' domination. Neighboring families and local society at large also contributed to the sisters' enduring notoriety. While some recounted their deeds with horror, others spoke in hushed tones, as if acknowledging them might summon a similar fate. Their cruelty became a benchmark, a measure against which other acts of punishment were judged, and even decades later, the name of the sisters evoked a shudder of fear or a somber recognition of the darkness that had once walked openly in their midst. The stories were embroidered with exaggeration over time, yet the kernel of truth remained undeniable. These women had inflicted unimaginable suffering, and the scale of their actions defied comprehension. Each retelling reinforced the sense of their omnipresence, the idea that their influence had transcended the mortal constraints of time and space to linger in the minds of those who survived, and those who heard the stories later. Historians and writers who later attempted to record the events found themselves confronting both the challenge of incomplete documentation and the almost mythic aura surrounding the sisters. Plantation records, legal documents, and newspaper reports offered fragmented evidence, sometimes failing to capture the full extent of their cruelty or the psychological devastation wrought upon the enslaved. Yet even with limited records, the sheer volume of deaths, the meticulous cruelty described in testimonies, and the consistency of oral accounts painted a picture of two women whose behavior exceeded what most contemporaries could imagine. In piecing together their story, chroniclers recognized a paradox. The sisters' brutality was both uniquely horrifying and yet somehow emblematic of the systemic horrors that slavery enabled. This duality contributed to the chilling fascination their story held for generations of observers, historians, and storytellers who struggled to reconcile the banality of human cruelty with its extraordinary manifestation in these two women. The legend of the sisters also took on elements of the supernatural in the retellings over time. It was said that their presence could still be felt at the plantation long after they had left or died, that shadows seemed to linger where they once stood, and that certain rooms or fields carried an oppressive weight that reminded even visitors of the terror that had unfolded there. These embellishments, while not verifiable, underscored the profound psychological impact of their actions and the way in which horror can seep into memory, transforming historical atrocity into legend. The sisters became larger-than-life figures, a symbol of what unchecked cruelty could achieve, their story blurring the boundaries between historical fact and the haunting narratives that spring from human imagination when confronted with evil. In communities shaped by the aftermath of their rule, the sisters' reputation became a reference point for discussions of morality, justice, and the consequences of absolute power. Parents used their story to instill caution, to warn against the temptation of abusing authority, and to illustrate the destructive potential of cruelty when it goes unchallenged. Scholars and storytellers examined the case as a study in psychological dominance, social complicity, and the terrifying capacity for violence that human beings could exercise under particular conditions. Over time, the story of the sisters transcended the specific geography of Mississippi, finding its place in a broader cultural consciousness as a reminder of the extremes of human cruelty and the enduring shadows that such acts leave behind. Even today, the plantation itself, abandoned or altered, carries echoes of the sisters' presence. Visitors report an uneasy atmosphere, an inexplicable sense of dread, and the knowledge that history has left indelible marks on the physical and psychological landscape. The sisters' story remains a chilling lesson in power, cruelty, and the dark potential that resides within ordinary people when societal structures and personal ambition intersect with malevolence. Their names endure in history and folklore, a testament to the horrors they inflicted and the unbroken thread of fear and fascination that continues to surround them.